Welcome back. The Open Restaurants program is set to become a permanent part of New York City's restaurant industry. What started out as emergency relief plan for New York City restaurants struggling with the realities of a pandemic has become a new way to enjoy the best New York City restaurants have to offer. Joining me to discuss the permanent addition to New York City is Executive Director for the New York City Hospitality Alliance, Andrew Rigie. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, to refresh our memory, because we did talk about this some time back, can you just explain what the Open Restaurants program is and how it actually began?
Great. Well, Open Restaurants, the program started back in June of 2020 as a direct response to the pandemic. As you recall, indoor dining was shut down. We had no idea when it was going to reopen. And we did know once we started to reopen, we were going to have limited and reduced indoor occupancy. So if we were going to serve customers and serve them safely, we could do so outside. But until that time, we only had about 1,200 licensed sidewalk cafes throughout the five boroughs. The Open Restaurants program was an emergency order that allowed restaurants throughout the city to expand both on the sidewalk and the roadway area, subject to certain limitations like a bus stop or a fire hydrant or other types of obstructions, to set up and serve folks outside. So we went from about 1,200 licensed sidewalk cafes to more than 12,000 restaurants participating in the Open Restaurants program, which was the emergency program to help save restaurants and jobs during the pandemic and allow people to dine outdoors safely. And it did all of that, brought vibrancy back to the streets, allowed people to get out of their homes and their apartments after months of lockdown, saved thousands and thousands of restaurants from shuttering, and is credited with saving about 100,000 jobs.
Now, were you surprised at all to see the success of Open Restaurants?
Well, we knew it was going to be successful because it was essential for restaurants to survive. We knew people wanted to come together to eat and drink and socialize because they had been stuck in lockdown. But, we didn't know the sheer success that it was going to be. I mean, I hear from restaurateurs all the time that said, if it wasn't for outdoor dining, my restaurant would not be here today. And the same goes with jobs. And, we saw in the middle of the pandemic in the freezing cold. It could be snowing out. And guess what? New Yorkers were dining outdoors. So I think there was like a civic duty among so many folks to say, you know what? We need to be together. We need to support our local businesses and the people working at these restaurants. And they did it.
Now, after the success of Open Restaurants, why did it take maybe a year or so to become a permanent part of New York City's restaurant industry?
Well, there is a whole process. So I think our elected leaders in the city saw the success of outdoor dining, restaurants, the people they employ. They saw the success and how it helped save their restaurants and how customers want to dine outdoors. Pandemic, no pandemic. They enjoy dining al fresco. So I think those leaders saw the interest of it, the success of the program, and they voted to make it permanent. However, now the hard work has really started because the city is still going through the program. Just because we're going to have permanent outdoor dining in the city of New York doesn't mean that we are making permanent the current Open Restaurants temporary emergency program. There's a whole legislative and policy making process going on right now to help standardize this program, to help make it more sustainable. There's a lot of beautiful outdoor dining setups. There's others that have been torn down or should be torn down or need to be upgraded. I think the program really showed the resilience and the ingenuity of these local small business owners to do what they needed to survive. But no one knew, almost 3 years later that we'd be in the situation we were and how long the pandemic was going to go on. So a lot of the materials that were used weren't weatherized. They weren't, used when restaurants had all these resources to properly invest. So there's a process going on right now to really upgrade the system to make sure that it will work well for many years to come.
Now, what are some of the key principles or guidelines of the permanent program?
Well, we want to make sure that restaurants have access to both sidewalk space and roadway space, but you also want to make sure that they comply with all the clearance, the Americans with Disability Act requirements. We want to make sure that any materials that are being used are weatherized, that they can hold up to the different elements of a winter, of a summer, and everything in between. We want to make sure that they're, attractive looking, but they're unique. We don't want everything to look so standardized, in our opinion. We really want restaurants to be able to give it their own flavor, their own flair, their own style that matches the culture of that restaurant. So it doesn't just look like a bunch of generic outdoor dining setups. I think what we're going to see is, if people remember sidewalk cafes before the pandemic, they'll look very similar on the sidewalk to what we had before the pandemic. But on the backside of that, we want a lot of the red tape, the bureaucracy, the expenses removed for small business owners. Because previously, like so many things for small businesses in the city, there was so much bureaucracy, so much red tape to get a sidewalk cafe. And for a lot of smaller restaurants, it was just cost prohibitive. So we want to get rid of that. The roadway seating is a novel, it's a new program. So, we want to make sure that there's different design options that work for the different communities that they serve.
How will this a permanent addition to the restaurant industry benefit New York City economically?
Well, I think that's going to be huge. As I said before, bringing back about 100,000 jobs. Restaurants, if they get more seats, they can employ more people, they can serve more customers. So, more jobs results in more payroll taxes, more people employed, spending money in New York. If more people are dining out and dining outdoors, they could be generating more tax revenue, which helps fund our city's essential services. Um, I just think you're buying more from the upstate farmer in New York. You're buying more from this purveyor, that supplier. So it's creating more economic activity. I also think that we've seen, when you have outdoor dining and when you have, open streets, which is another program, um, and it's combined with outdoor dining, it actually creates even more economic activity. So I think when there's excitement, when there's a vibrancy on the city streets, it can bring more people out to spend money, creating more jobs, and just creating a more vibrant streetscape that belongs to the people instead of just belonging to cars.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about smaller restaurants. You briefly mentioned them. What impact did the Open Restaurants program have for those restaurants or for restaurants in lower income areas like the Bronx?
Yeah, well, there were very few outdoor dining sidewalk cafes in the Bronx pre-pandemic. That number increased, by the hundreds because of outdoor dining. So many of these restaurants, either they were restricted from having them, there was too much bureaucracy, too much red tape, and the cost was prohibitive. So we went from, I forget the exact number, but not that many sidewalk cafes to, hundreds of restaurants in the Bronx doing outdoor dining. And I think under a permanent program, once folks know, here's the requirements, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do, here's how to do it, and if the city gets it right, um, it'll be really, really successful. Councilmember Marjorie Velasquez from the Bronx is the prime sponsor of the legislation. So I know she's taken it really to heart and really wants to make sure that the program is accessible for restaurants in the Bronx to participate in, because everyone should have that benefit if they want to dine outdoors or they want to have a restaurant to be able to have outdoor dining. It shouldn't be reserved for the lucky, few or the lucky group primarily that was located south of 96th Street in Manhattan. I mean, they should have them too, but it should be an inclusive 5 borough wide program that restaurants can participate in and people that live and work in those boroughs can enjoy as well.
I like that you brought that up because I do think, I mean, if you go through Manhattan, you can see a difference of the outdoor structures. And I know recently you talked about abandoned structures. I saw a few of those in the Bronx. So I was worried if this would be something a lot of lower income area restaurants could maintain. Could you talk a little bit about them, a little bit about that? Is this something that they can do long term?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the goal is, and what we're advocating for is to make sure that there's not a lot of that red tape and bureaucracy, and it's not cost prohibitive for smaller restaurants in all types of neighborhoods to be able to participate. That's an essential part of the program for us. I think the sidewalk will probably be more accessible. It's easier. Tables, chairs, maybe some umbrellas. You can bring them in at night or you lock them up. That's much easier. The roadway is a little bit more complicated because it's costly. There's different uses of the street, so there's all these different considerations that need to be decided whether or not to have it. But I do think restaurants in the Bronx, in all different neighborhoods, will be able to have it should they choose. That's the real goal that we want. And I think the Open Restaurants Emergency Program showed that when you make it easy enough for businesses to apply, you don't burden them with all these costs, they will participate. So we have seen that it works if the city does it right. So now we need to make sure that as they transition from the temporary emergency program to new guidelines under a permanent program, they get it right again. So it's inclusive, it's an equitable program that businesses throughout the Bronx and throughout the other four boroughs can all participate in.
So we have about a minute left. Can you quickly talk about, just the application process if there is one and how people can learn more about that?
Well, so that whole process still has to be developed. Currently, the city council is deliberating the legislation that will set some guidelines and structures for the program. It'll then have to be signed into law by the mayor. We're hoping that'll happen this year or very early in 2023. Then it'll go through rulemaking process where there's another public hearing, and they'll define some more of the specifics about the application process. But we know we're getting some things removed. You won't need a certified architect to certify your drawing, which took time, which took money. We
Right.
want to make sure that the process is a little bit quicker and the costs are down. So we hope it'll be a much more streamlined and faster and less expensive process than people had to go through if they wanted a sidewalk cafe before the pandemic.
All right. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Open BXRX Tuesday.